Good evening. This is a tape of the John McGoff lecture series, Debate on Funding Sources, given 29 October 1979 in Jamrich Hall 101 on the campus of Northern Michigan University in Marquette, Michigan.
My name is Earl Hahn, president of the Political Science Symposium, Northern Michigan University student organization. Tonight, Professors Robert Cooke and James Greene will debate AAUP's decision to dissociate from the Distinguished Lectured Series. The speakers are debating their own positions and do not represent an organization. Each speaker will be allotted 15 minutes for their presentation, followed by a 10-minute rebuttal and a 5-minute closing statement. The remaining time will be allotted for questions from the audience with a response and rebuttal by the speakers. The timekeeper for this evening is Bill Patnode, also of the Political Science Symposium. At a flip of a coin, prior to this introduction, it was determined that Professor Greene will begin tonight's program. Professor Greene.
I'm here to make the case for disassociation. In making this case, I want to raise two questions. The first is this: what constitutes a good reason for disassociation? That's a normative question. Second, I want to raise the question, does a good reason, if I'm able to outline one, apply to this particular act of disassociation? I want to argue that it does. Let me then try to deal with the normative question by asking you whether or not the following claims, if true, would constitute a good reason for disassociating from the McGoff lecture series. I'm not claiming at this moment that they are true. I'm simply asking you, consider what you would think if they were true, would they be a good reason? Here they are. Suppose there exists a $70 million illegal South Africa propaganda fund. Suppose the purpose of this fund is to defend apartheid in world opinion. Suppose also that part of this fund, $11 million, was given to John McGoff to spread this money in the United States to influence opinion here. And suppose that McGoff has used some of this money to start the lecture series at NMU. And suppose also that NMU is not told the source or the purpose of this fund. So much for the lecture money. Suppose this about McGoff. Suppose McGoff has a major influence on which speakers are chosen. Suppose also that in his past behavior he has done the following: that he has tried to force the editors of his papers to publish articles attacking Jimmy Carter, which were so irresponsible that the editors of those papers felt compelled to resign, and so did many reporters. Suppose also that with the South African fund money, he tried to buy the Washington Star in order to influence American opinion. Suppose also that he bought the Sacramento Union, the same South African money. Suppose also that he bought the shares in the United Press International TV News for the same purpose. Suppose that all these conditions were true. Suppose, finally, that he was fined $10,000 for refusing to disclose the funding for the Sacramento Union in court in California this summer. I ask you, supposing all these things were true, would that be a good reason for the faculty to disassociate itself from the McGoff Lecture Fund? That is, suppose that the lecture fund was in fact funded by a secret propaganda fund designed to promote the South African position of apartheid. I hope that Professor Cooke, in his response at some point, will tell us whether or not, on this normative question, that would constitute a good reason or not. But that's the normative question. The next question is facts. How many of those claims are true? How many of them are open to debate? Bob Cooke, in his many letters on this issue, has characterized them, one and all, as media hype, innuendos, and false assumptions. Never has he attempted to defend any of these astonishing claims. He's claiming now not only that these opinions are false, not only that if true that they're uncompelling, but rather that they're unprofessional, manipulative, and dishonest. I want to go over some of those claims and tell you the reasons why I think they are, at the very least, plausible. some things seem indisputable. Some things seem indisputable. One, the editors of the Escanaba paper and the Marquette Mining Journal both resigned because they could not, in good conscience, print the kinds of articles that McGoff asked them to print. That other reporters resigned as a result of the same action, no one doubts. No one doubts that this resulted from McGoff asking them to print articles about Jimmy Carter. I think it's indisputable that McGoff was fined $10,000 in California. I think finally, in his treatment of his competitors in this community, there was an episode in which one competitor was publishing a rival paper, and when that competitor's son apparently committed suicide, the Mining Journal ran it with the front page cover of the blood on the ground. Did McGoff do that, or was it simply the editor's choice? I think McGoff has a much closer connection to that paper than you might think. The evidence for that is what happened today. Today I called the Mining Journal and asked them, why didn't you print my side of the debate after you print Cooke's? And the editor of the paper told me that at the order of his publisher, John P. McGoff, they refused to print my letter. Under those conditions, I have refused to cooperate with the Mining Journal tonight. Finally, South Africa money. What kind of evidence is there for that? According to the Erasmus report, which is a Blue Ribbon Commission of the South African own government, money was given to John P. McGoff, by name in the report, $11 million to influence American media. It's named in the report that this money was funneled through Global Communications, a McGoff corporation, and that Global Communications money was used to buy the Sacramento Union, was used to attempt to buy the Washington Star, was used to buy shares in United Press International TV News. Global Communications is also the corporation through which the John P. McGoff lecture series is funded.
Professor Cooke.
Tonight we are here to discuss a topic that is of interest to the entire university community. It is of interest for at least two primary reasons. First of all, it involves an action taken by a major component of that community, namely the faculty, and its action to withdraw support from a major ongoing lecture series. Secondly, and more importantly, the action taken is significant because it raises serious questions about the meaning and the nature of the educational process at Northern Michigan University. To evaluate this action, let us proceed in three distinct steps. First, we will consider the meaning of the resolution. Secondly, we will judge the merits of the resolution. And thirdly, we will try to evaluate what the implications of this action are. The resolution is couched in the following specific terms, dated in a memo from David Goldsmith on October 2nd, 1979. And I'm going to quote, "Resolved that the faculty of Northern Michigan University disassociate itself from the John P. McGoff lecture series until such time as the current investigation into McGoff's alleged use of funds provided by the South African government is completed. The faculty takes this action because of its concern shared by many businesses and institutions nationwide over the racial policies of the government of South Africa and because it finds these policies to be inconsistent with the humanistic principles underlying the functions of this university. The faculty of Northern Michigan University will rescind its action when it has been assured by the administration that the John P. McGoff lecture series is not supported by monies derived from the government of South Africa. The nature of this debate is over the merits of this resolution and nothing else. As stated, this resolution incorporates two main items. First of all, it calls for the faculty as a whole to disassociate itself, whatever that means, until the investigation of the alleged money connection is completed. In lieu of this, the faculty claims to be willing to settle on an assurance by the administration that there is no such money connection with South Africa. Secondly, it attempts to provide justification for the resolution by appealing to the claim that the racial policy known as apartheid is inconsistent with the humanistic principles underlying the functions of this university. What are we to make of this resolution? It is difficult, first of all, to determine what is meant by disassociation. At best, it seems to imply that the faculty will withdraw its support in one of several ways. One, not attending the lecture functions involved with the McGoff lecture series. Two, not publicizing the event to the students in our classes, as is customary in many events. Three, not presenting or actively participating with speakers supported by the lecture series. Fourth, mandatory classes and tests on the days of the lecture, and so forth. Of course, and I'm sure some students would be happy with that, would they not? Of course, the extent of the non-involvement will vary from faculty member to faculty member. This is particularly true in light of the nature of the vote, 114 for, 101 against. The issue is even more clouded when the president of the union calls for the faculty to abide by the decision. What does this mean? I haven't the foggiest idea. The real issue turns on a consideration of the merits of the resolution itself, its justifying basis. Of course, we begin with the assumption that we are in a position to offer guidance in this field of racial relations. Yet there is a divergence of opinion on this matter. Recently, for example, in an article titled "The Wrong Way to Protest South Africa's Racial Policies," Clifton Warden, a noted black economist at the University of Chicago, wrote the following, and I quote, "Many U.S. black leaders have visited South Africa recently and have studied the situation. Reluctantly, they have concluded that withdrawal would set back precisely the group of South African blacks who represent the cutting edge of economic change and progress. This position of U.S. black leaders is understandable, since this is not the first time that white liberals have advocated a policy at the expense of those blacks they ostensibly seek to help. Unhappily, our nation's history is scattered with the bodies of blacks sacrificed to provide liberal credentials for patronizing or paternalistic white liberals." And end quote. Let us assume, however, in our wisdom that Mr. Wharton is incorrect and that the resolution should in fact be passed. What are its merits? When this is done, the resolution becomes suspect. First of all, the resolution condemns the racial policies that are in force in South Africa. Certainly, many people of goodwill may question the measures taken to maintain stability in that region of the world, although I don't claim to be a historian on South Africa. Yet it does assume that Mr. McGoff has close ties with that government. Where is the proof of this involvement, I ask again? Does the AAUP have evidence to support this claim more than just supposition, as Mr. Greene seems content with? If there is such proof, then the AAUP is legally compelled to turn this over to the proper authorities, and I'm sure they would have by now. Of course, the chances of the Executive Committee having such evidence are slim. Thus, it must base its case on innuendo, and I will, of course, eradicate the word media hype here. Let us talk about media sensationalism. However, for the sake of argument, let us assume that a connection could be found. We would then have to make the assumption that Mr. McGoff directly or indirectly supports and promotes those racial policies in force in South Africa. This would also require some hard evidence. Otherwise, we would have to resort to an argument based on guilt by association. And as I have tried to point out, we as rational people should recognize that this is not only a logical fallacy, but it does not seem consistent with the quote-unquote humanistic principles underlying the functions of this university, a phrase coined by the framers of the resolution, not myself. Ask them what they mean. Professor Greene points out that this will not affect Mr. Hanna, for example, the next lecturer in the series. Yet this observation seems to ignore the tone and the content of the ongoing debate, for the resolution is based on such an assumption of guilt association. I remember that during President Ford's presentation, Ford was asked at least twice how he could in good faith come to Northern under the auspices of a series funded by South African money. Of course, such a question points out the fallacy of guilt by association. It also shows that it carries over to the lecturers themselves. Curiously, Professor Greene is silent on this issue in reference to Mr. McGoff. Should we as a faculty continue to use this fallacy? I would say we should not. Secondly, the resolution assumes that Mr. McGoff is guilty of some crime against humanity. The unstated assumption is that Mr. McGoff is guilty until proven innocent. Fortunately, our legal and moral systems are based on the assumption that one is innocent until proven guilty. To rely on the media or the intuitions of a few who have decided to be both judge and jury is not in keeping with the nature of an academic environment or the meaning of a moral community. Indeed, such an assumption again seems to violate those humanistic principles underlying the nature of this university. Now, Professor Greene claims that the resolution does not assume guilt on the part of Mr. McGoff. As we've noted in the North Wind, it is not a condemnation, supposedly. How does Professor Greene support this assertion? He provides us the example of a patient who is dissatisfied with the medical treatment that this patient has received. No one would deny that the patient has a right to form a judgment about the physician, an independent moral judgment. Yet Professor Greene fails to connect this example with the situation under consideration. There is a significant difference between an individual who judges a doctor to be incompetent and a faculty as a whole which decides to withdraw support to a major lecture series. Our actions would affect large numbers of people who have no voice in the process, especially here students. Certainly we do make independent moral judgments, yet such normative judgments have different implications when we allegedly speak for the entire academic community. More importantly, we as academics have a responsibility to appeal to reason, not emotion. Professor Greene skirts this issue by drawing a distinction between the law and common or normative morality. Certainly there is often a difference, yet the motivation for assuring the rights of the innocent is based on a common moral attitude that values reasoning over emotional appeals to menus and faulty assumptions. To ignore this fact is to ignore the moral underpinnings of the legal system that protects the free and open exchange of ideas. Thirdly, the framers of the resolution assume that Mr. McGoff has used undue influence to secure speakers that would support the policies of the government of South Africa. Again, where is the evidence? As a participant in the first lecture series given by President Ford, I remember that he specifically disassociated himself from such policies. The fact that Mr. McGoff has certain controls over those selected is not unusual. Most foundations and lectureships are given with the understanding that certain conditions should be met. This enables a person or foundation to guarantee that the funds will be used responsibly. Though such an arrangement may bother some, its advantages outweigh the disadvantages. To deny students the opportunities for such experiences and to assume that Mr. McGoff is a vehicle for South African propaganda are steps that are not in keeping, again, with the humanistic principles underlying the functions of this university. As I have pointed out, this level of control by Mr. McGoff does not include veto power, as Mr. Greene has erroneously stated in his second letter. I quote from the actual contract. All decisions of the committee, except as herein expressly provided, shall be taken by majority vote. Now, if my analysis is correct, then the underpinnings of the resolution fail. This then leads to a basic question of the implications of such an action. Simply put, the resolution appeals to emotion rather than reason. It legitimizes judgments about the character of Mr. McGoff rather than the merits of the resolution. As numerous faculty members have stated to me in private, the resolution is weak, but I cannot support a person like Mr. McGoff, even though most of them have never met him. This type of appeal is not surprising in the post-Watergate era, which influences the academic climate of a university as it does the whole community. Yet as educators, we must be on guard against such appeals, for it not only sets a bad precedent, it also tends to restrict the free and open exchange of ideas. Thus, academic freedom comes into the picture. According to Professor Greene, if students are persuaded not to attend the lectures because of the resolution, this is an exercise of academic freedom. Such a claim is surprising, since most defenders of academic freedom believe that students should be encouraged to listen to all points of view. If our actions as a faculty tend to discourage attendance at the McGoff Lecture Series, then we seem to be working against such a principle. Is this in keeping with the basic goals of higher education? Should we influence students this way if we or they are as impressionable as Professor Greene seems to claim? Many supporters of academic freedom would at least answer no. After all, basic rights have certain restrictions. To yell fire in a crowded theater is an exercise of freedom of speech, yet it is an irresponsible use or exercise of this right. To distribute information in my classroom on how to take over the administration building is an exercise of academic freedom, but again, it seems to be irresponsible. In the same way, to discourage students from attending the McGoff Lecture Series is an exercise of academic freedom. But is it responsible? Many would say no, because it seems to go against one of the underlying principles of academic freedom, namely encouraging all students to expose themselves to all points of view, whatever the source may be. Ladies and gentlemen, I propose that to go against such a principle is an example of McCarthyism in reverse. Thank you.
A time of 10 minutes has been allotted for the rebuttal. Professor Greene.
In my opening presentation, I said there were two issues, one normative, one factual. On the factual issue, I presented various kinds of reports and evidence which suggested the claims mentioned in the normative issue were true. I challenged Bob Cooke to justify the claims that he's made repeatedly that these charges are merely a media hype, false assumptions, innuendos. In his speech, the way he's addressed that charge is by saying he drops the word media hype and substitutes the word sensationalism. That really won't do. He doesn't tell us whether or not the Erasmus report exists. Does he deny that South Africa exists? Does he deny the Erasmus report exists? Does he deny that McGoff is mentioned in the Erasmus report? Does he deny that McGoff is accused in the Erasmus report of having taken $11.5 million and bought shares in UPITN, United Press International Television News, the Sacramento Union, and attempted to buy the Washington Star? He doesn't say, he just says media hype, media hype, media hype. So that challenge has not been met. I don't know what to say about the charge that I'm guilty of McCarthyism in reverse. On a recent radio show, he said I was violating your academic freedom by giving my arguments, because I'm subtly somehow discouraging you from going to the McGoff lectures. I'm not subtly discouraging anybody. It's not subtle, it's not indirect, it's direct. I'm telling you that you ought to disassociate yourself from that lecture series. I'm giving you my arguments. I think it's an exercise of academic freedom. I think the issue is complicated. I don't think we get anywhere by calling someone a McCarthyite. I think we need arguments. He hasn't presented them. Third issue. He claims that he raises the challenge. He says, curiously, Dr. Greene has not said whether or not McGoff is guilty by association. It's not very curious. Take the phrase guilty by association. It has an ambiguous use. I'll give you two examples of guilty by association. In one case, Jones commits a terrible crime. His brother does nothing. And people say, I'm not going to hire his brother. After all, the other guy killed somebody. That's guilt by association in an invidious, bad sense. The brother is not responsible for what the other person did. Here's another example of guilt by association. We're running a fence in which one guy steals the diamonds, the other guy sells them, right? He knows he's getting stolen diamonds and he's fencing around the world. We arrest him and he says, but you're making me guilty by association. Right. It depends on the quality of the association, not merely the guy's brother. You're part of the operation. You're part of the operation. I ask you, is John McGoff, with his $11 million stuffed in his pockets, going around the world trying to buy up media, is he more like the brother who is guilty of nothing, or like the fence? Cooke raises another question about guilty till proved innocent. He says that he charges me with assuming that McGoff is guilty until proved innocent. In a paper that I wrote, or in a letter that I wrote, I said this: I'm not holding him legally guilty. I'm not attempting to impose any legal sanctions on him. I'm simply coming to a judgment on him before legal findings are reached. I see nothing wrong with that. I attribute to Cooke the position, the principle, because he objected to it, that it's always wrong. It's always wrong to come to judgments about persons' bad behavior before a legal finding is rendered. And I gave what I thought was a legitimate counterexample to that principle. It's a universal principle. It says all acts of independent judgment prior to legal findings are wrong. I gave a counterexample. I said if a mother refuses to take her children to a pediatrician before he's found guilty of malpractice, there's nothing wrong with that. You can stop taking your children to doctors when you have good reason to suspect that they're incompetent and dangerous. You don't have to wait till a court finds the same thing. Cooke objects to that and says there are disanalogies. And he says what's going on here is this. He says it would be wrong for the faculty to take an action before legal findings are rendered if the faculty is speaking for the whole community, is speaking for the students who have no voice. Well, the faculty, as a matter of fact, if he read the resolution, would find is not speaking for the students, is not speaking for the whole university. It's speaking only for the faculty. His objection simply does not apply. We're not speaking for you. Do whatever you please. Pass a resolution, don't pass a resolution, go to the talk, don't go to the talk. We've just said, as a faculty, things are bad enough, we're suspicious enough of this operation that we're calling everyone's attention to the fact that there looks like a connection between the McGoff lecture series and a secret propaganda fund. That's all we're doing. We're not even necessarily telling you not to go to the lecture. Some faculty may even, who have voted for the resolution, go to the lecture. They may have been satisfied with the public act of disapproval. I don't know.
Yes, you do. Professor Cooke.
Let me try to respond for the first time to Professor Greene's claim that I failed to respond to the basic arguments that he has raised. And I refer to the letter in which he lists a number of charges involving the character of Mr. McGoff. I am not going to sit here and deny that one could interpret the actions by Mr. McGoff in relation to competitors or to internal affairs within the mining journal, or to basic issues of whether or not Mr. McGoff likes Jimmy Carter. A great number of people do not. I'm not going to respond to that because I think that the evidence given is unconvincing. What it does prove is the following. Namely, that Mr. Greene would like to rewrite the resolution to include references to these particular kinds of situations. The resolution itself speaks to whether or not John McGoff, through connections with at least alleged connections with South Africa, has influenced opinion on this campus to the extent that we should not want to be associated with such a lecture series. And that is all the resolution directs its attention to. It does not direct its attention to the competition of the mining journal, to whether or not Jimmy Carter is responsible or irresponsible, or whether Mr. McGoff thinks so, whether or not Mr. McGoff has written obituaries that have sensationalized certain kinds of unfortunate situations in the community. The resolution doesn't address that. Mr. Greene knows this. What he is in fact trying to say is essentially this, and I would give him credit for that, namely that the idea of controversy is the primary issue. If in fact Mr. McGoff is a controversial figure, which does in fact include these particular allegations, whether or not they're true, then we as a university have a ripe opportunity to set a principle, to set an example for the university community, namely that we are self-righteous enough to recognize these particular errors and to call attention to them and to take a stand. Certainly, if that's the resolution, and the resolution we voted on was the wrong resolution, it should have read something like the following. Since Mr. John P. McGoff is a controversial person in the community, has angered certain individuals, we as a faculty should disassociate ourselves from this particular gentleman in his lecture series. But that's not what the resolution addresses at all, and Mr. Greene knows this. That's why I haven't responded to this. Now, what would constitute a good reason for disassociating from the lecture series? I suppose a good reason would in fact be if we could show that Mr. McGoff had killed somebody or had been involved in some heinous crime. We probably would have to reconsider whether or not we wanted to be associated with money from that source. But again, this is a separate issue. For example, if we could in fact in the future, through the legal process, identify Mr. McGoff as having close ties or connections with the South African government, we might at that particular time decide to make a decision. But the time to make that decision is then and not prematurely. And secondly, if in fact this would be proven to be the case, and again I am supposing in the typical style that Mr. Greene has adopted here, if this was the case, we would have a second debate, whether or not we should be connected with money from South Africa. And that is a second, more fundamental issue than the resolution involved. That would involve a different debate with a whole set of different guidelines. Mr. Greene knows this, but he is confusing both of these issues together. The only thing that I can say in relation to this particular issue of whether or not there are good reasons or not, that's an issue that has to be decided at a later point. I don't think we have provided good enough reasons at this point to adopt this kind of resolution. The second thing that I want to talk about is academic freedom. I certainly have tried to argue here, and I know it's a difficult argument to support, because often it is when we talk about freedom, equality, and liberty, oftentimes in following and supporting these rights, we have to abridge the rights of other people. Anyone looking for a job today, for example, knows that when affirmative action in force often involves difficult kinds of issues of restricting basic rights. The point of this, however, is whether or not in encouraging students we are in fact going against the basic principle of academic freedom. I think we are. If academic freedom is to be interpreted as encouraging students to the widest possible scope of ideas, whatever the source, any type of action, such as a disassociation, which encourages students from attending, is a violation of that principle. And I don't think you can escape that. You may be able to justify it on the basis that the situation merits this abridgment of academic freedom, but I don't think you've shown that at all. My basic concern with the McGoff lecture series and the disassociation resolution is the following: that primarily the students are, in fact, affected in a way that I think is detrimental to the overall quality of education at this university. I know for a fact, and anyone that's been around campus lately knows, that various students have pulled away their connections from the lecture of Hannah, who is coming to campus fairly soon. This, of course, not only provides a problem for the committee that has to make the arrangements, but it also issues a statement that I think is not necessary. We also know, of course, that the student government has decided in their infinite wisdom, by a vote of 7-4, to support an equally dubious kind of resolution, although I've been assured by them that the timing is just rather suspicious. It has no direct tie-in. And we also know from experiences on campus that certain student groups needing funds for legitimate speakers have decided not to approach the McGoff lecture series for this money, even though such an action may curtail or prevent the legitimate exercise of academic freedom on the part of these students. And all I can say to this is this seems to go against the basic ideal of education as far as I'm concerned, and I, as many faculty have shown in this vote, do not want to be associated with this type of action. Now, certainly I did not accuse Mr. Greene of being a McCarthyite, but I did, in fact, accuse the tone and nature of the debate as smacking of McCarthyism. I can still remember from clips, I'm not that old, of McCarthy waving the New York Times and the Washington Post and saying, "This is the evidence." And I can remember an officer of the union waving the charges by the SEC and so forth and saying, "This is evidence." Ladies and gentlemen, that's not evidence, that's bull.
Only smacking of McCarthyism now. I will.
We reverse the order on the closing statement.
Sorry.
In the light of fairness, we will reverse the order during the closing statements, and Professor Cooke will go first.
Professor, is this on? Okay. Professor Greene and I have had some good jousting tonight. It doesn't necessarily indicate that there is a major falling out between us, I hope. That in an academic environment, we can have a free and open exchange of ideas, no matter what labels we throw at each other. But in closing, I would like to make the following kind of, let's say, utopian view of a university. I think that the root problem of this particular resolution is not only that the merits of the resolution are dubious, but it leads to the kind of divisiveness and animosity and lack of charity and compassion on a university campus that is needed for the free and open exchange of ideas. The key word is tolerance and respect. This type of resolution goes against that in many serious ways, and I've tried to show some of those ways in which it raises spurious kinds of claims based on illogical thinking. Now, certainly emotion is important, and obviously we are emotionally involved in this debate. Anybody here knows this. But emotion has a place in the university in a second level rather than first. Reason should, in fact, be the paramount guide in our deliberations. And with reason comes charity and compassion and tolerance. And what this particular resolution has done is to create a certain adversariness within the faculty itself, within the university. And I don't really think that it created it. It is symptomatic of the kind of adversary relationship that exists on campus. Now, I don't want to blame any group or number of individuals for this, but I think it's high time that we get down to the business of learning and educating rather than worrying about whether or not we can create adversary relations with the administration and other segments of the university. I didn't mention that tonight because I've been shown that this is, let us say, poisoning the argument, but I think it is a relevant issue, the issue of intent. It seems to me that the resolution will, in fact, envelop important people who really believe in the genuine concern of the resolution and have voted so and have exercised a legitimate and responsible action. On the other hand, I am convinced from personal experience with several individuals on campus that many motivations are not as clear and that in fact it is fostered to create a certain adversary relationship between the faculty and the administration. And of course, again, as I have emphasized before, the real losers in such a relationship are the students. My job is to teach. It is not necessarily to create as many thorns in the flesh of the president of this university as I can come up with, or to create the kind of animosity and bitterness that exist on campus. We would all, I suppose, be best suited, according to the words of one very wise English professor, to go home and grow potatoes. Thank you.
Professor Greene.
I thought the issue was, is it right for the university to accept a lecture series funded by propaganda money in which the person who's the agent of that propaganda has important influence over the speakers that are chosen? I've said it should reject such speaker funds if there's sufficient evidence to indicate that the money comes from a source of propaganda. I've tried to suggest that the kind of evidence is available to let us take an act of disassociation. I'm not persuaded by Bob Cooke now exchanging media hype, innuendo, sensationalism for the word bull. That hasn't gotten us any further. In closing, a few remarks. Some years ago, Stephen Spender was editor of Encounter magazine, which was funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. In the late 60s and early 70s, it was discovered that the CIA was secretly funneling money into the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which in turn was funneling the money into Encounter magazine to promote those opinions. Stephen Spender, as editor, never knew that the money came from the CIA. When he discovered that it did, he resigned because he thought that magazines ought to be edited in a way in which they were above suspicion of manipulation. The Chicago Tribune, not exactly a left-wing publication, has made the following comments on McGoff in relationship to newspapers. We object most emphatically to foreign governments buying into U.S. newspapers in secret deals. It may not be illegal, but it is certainly unethical. It is unethical on the part of the giver, which is why the United States should never make clandestine payments to foreign journalists. It is even more unethical on the part of a knowing recipient, which is where Northern is, especially in a country that prides itself on the freedom and independence of its news organizations. Perhaps Mr. McGoff, when and if he breaks his silence on the case, can offer an explanation. But if not, if he entered into the arrangement fully aware that he was giving a foreign government secret influence in the U.S. press, he deserves the censure of his publishing colleagues and of the readers and viewers whose trust was betrayed. For Northern to enter into a relationship with a source of funds controlled from without for the purpose of propaganda is to betray the trust of the people with whom we deal, the faculty, the students, and the community. When the faculty voted to disassociate from this lecture series, no one suppressed any opinion. No one was saying that John McGoff is unwelcome to come here and defend apartheid of South Africa. As Bob Cooke calls it, the efforts to bring stability to that region of the world. I suggest that you look at books such as this by Donald Woods on Biko, and simply open the early pages in which they discuss what's happened to people who've been incarcerated in South Africa. And you'll see how they bring stability to that region of the world.
we're suppressing no opinions. We're not interfering with anybody going to that lecture. The faculty members like Bob Cooke, who voted against the resolution, are perfectly free to go to that lecture. All we're saying is the faculty is publicly calling to your attention and to the whole community's attention the dangerous connection that exists between the McGoff lecture series and outside propaganda money. Thank you.
We'll use the remaining 30 minutes for questions and responses, with time also allotted for rebuttal to the response. If you are called on, please state your question concisely and clearly. We have provided 3 minutes for the response with 2 minutes for the rebuttal, as well as alternating the questions. So with that, we'll begin now by asking for a question for Professor Cooke.
The president of the university and the chairman of the board of control. Yes, and Mr. McGoff.
The only comment that I would make is that in my letter to the faculty, it's okay. In my letter to the faculty, I originally referred to McGoff having a veto power. All he's saying that President Jeremy had sent me a copy of the contract, the veto power, only over using all the money in 1 year for one speaker, and I announced to the faculty that I was mistaken and apologized for it.
Is there a question for Professor Greene? Yes.
With that speaker, faculty as a whole can diminish the effect of that speaker. And I think if the faculty disassociates with all the speakers in this series, I believe that.
Do you have a question?
Yes,
Good.
so that speaker will be diminished. How can the faculty justify that?
First of all, I don't think that we weaken the speaker's arguments or presentation one bit by not showing up. I've been not showing up for all kinds of lectures for years and no one's noticed. Second, I think that there's something positive that is to be gained from what